The Winchester rifle cracked like thunder across the canyon, and Douglas Williams dropped where he stood, his hands still reaching for the stolen mare. Rachel Morales worked the lever action with practiced precision, brass shells spinning through the morning air as she shifted her aim to the second man. Alan Torres had time to register the impossible accuracy of that shot, time to understand that the quiet widow they had been tormenting for weeks was not what she seemed, before the second bullet took him center mass. From her position on the ridge overlooking her homestead, Rachel could see the remaining three outlaws scrambling for cover behind her barn. They had come expecting to find a defenseless woman, easy prey for their intimidation. Instead, they had walked into a killing field prepared by someone who had spent 20 years learning how to read terrain like scripture and turn geography into a weapon. Thomas Kim shouted from behind the water trough, "You are making a big mistake, lady. We got friends coming, and when they get here, you are going to wish you had just given us what we wanted." Rachel adjusted her scope, calculating wind drift and bullet drop, with the automatic precision of someone who had made shots like this when lives depended on it. When she spoke, her voice carried across the distance with deadly calm. "The mistake was yours, Thomas. You took my horse. That was your warning. Now you get to learn why they used to call me the Ghost of Gettysburg Ridge." The name hit the survivors like a physical blow. Even out here in the Montana Territory, the legend had traveled. Stories of a federal marshal who could track through solid rock and put a bullet through a silver dollar at 300 yards. Tales of the woman who had single-handedly brought down the Crimson Creek gang and walked away from ambushes that should have killed her 10 times over. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story of how a quiet homesteader became the deadliest shot in the West is just getting started. But to understand how Rachel Morales came to be perched on that ridge with her sights on three terrified outlaws, we need to go back 6 weeks, to the morning when her peaceful life began to unravel. The rooster crowed at first light, same as always, and Rachel rolled out of her narrow bed with the easy motion of someone accustomed to hard work in early mornings. Her homestead sat in a valley carved between two ridges of the Bitterroot Mountains, isolated enough that she could go weeks without seeing another soul, which was exactly how she preferred it. She pulled on worn leather boots and a flannel shirt that had seen better years, then stepped onto the porch of her cabin to survey her small kingdom. 40 acres of good grazing land, a barn that she had built with her own hands, and a corral that currently held the most beautiful mare in 3 territories. Black Tusk was a Morgan horse with the intelligence of a border collie and the speed of a thoroughbred, worth more than most men made in a year. Rachel had found the horse as a yearling, half dead from a mountain lion attack, and nursed her back to health through a brutal winter. Now Black Tusk followed her around like a devoted dog and could read her commands from the slightest shift in weight or touch of rein. They were partners in the truest sense, and the mare was the closest thing to family Rachel had left in this world. The morning routine never varied. Check the chickens, milk the goat, inspect the fence line for damage from elk or bears. Rachel moved through these tasks with efficient competence, her hands steady and her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Old habits died hard, and even 3 years of peaceful homesteading had not completely erased the hypervigilance that had kept her alive through 2 decades of hunting the worst men the frontier had to offer. She was mending a section of fence when she noticed the tracks. 5 horses, unshod, moving at an easy walk along the creek that marked her eastern boundary. The prints were fresh, maybe 2 hours old, and something about their spacing told her the riders had been taking their time, studying her layout. Rachel knelt beside the clearest print and ran her fingers along its edges. The horse that made this track was favoring its left front hoof, probably from an old stone bruise. The rider was heavy, better than 200 pounds, and careless about his mount. These were not the tracks of honest travelers passing through. She followed the sign for a quarter mile, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken grass. The riders had circled her property twice, always staying just outside the fence line, always keeping to cover when possible. They had spent considerable time watching her cabin from a stand of pines on the northern ridge, and they had paid particular attention to her corral. Horse thieves. Rachel had dealt with their kind before, back when she wore a badge and carried federal authority. They would watch a place for days or weeks, learning routines and looking for weaknesses. Then they would strike fast and hard, usually in the hour before dawn, when their targets were deepest in sleep. But these men had made a mistake. They had assumed that a woman alone would be easy prey, and they had not bothered to cover their tracks. Rachel could follow their trail back to their camp with her eyes closed, and she could probably identify each horse and rider from the sign they had left behind. She was considering her options when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the south. 5 riders came up the valley at an easy lope, making no attempt at concealment. They were rough men, the kind who wore their guns low and their hats pulled down to shadow hard faces. Their leader was a big man with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Rachel straightened slowly, her hand drifting toward the Colt revolver at her hip. The motion was casual, almost unconscious, but her fingers settled on the grip with the familiarity of long practice. The riders pulled up 20 feet from her fence, close enough to talk, but far enough to make a quick escape if necessary. Their leader touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Morning, ma'am. Name is Larry Murphy. We are just passing through your fine territory, and we could not help but notice that beautiful horse of yours. Black Tusk, is it not?" Rachel did not answer immediately. She was cataloging details with the automatic precision of someone trained to remember faces for wanted posters. Murphy was left-handed, evidenced by the way his gun belt hung. The man to his right had a fresh scar across his knuckles, probably from a recent fight. The youngest of the group kept glancing toward her corral, confirming her suspicion about their intentions. "She is not for sale," Rachel said finally. Her voice was steady, neither friendly nor hostile. Murphy chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Well now, that is a shame. See, we have been admiring that mare for some time, and we have developed quite an attachment to her. A woman alone out here, well, it seems to me she might be better off with some protection. These mountains can be dangerous for folks who do not know how to handle themselves." The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was a threat nonetheless. Rachel had heard variations of this speech 100 times before, usually just before she arrested someone or put them in the ground. "I handle myself just fine," she replied. "I suggest you move along before this conversation gets complicated." The outlaws exchanged glances, and Murphy's smile widened. "Complicated. I like that. Tell you what, lady, we are going to give you some time to think about our offer. Maybe when we come back, you will be feeling more cooperative." They wheeled their horses and rode back down the valley, but Rachel knew they would not go far. Men like Murphy did not make idle threats, and they would not be discouraged by a woman's refusal. They would be back, probably tonight, and they would not bother with conversation the second time. Rachel waited until the riders disappeared around the bend before she allowed herself to move. Then she walked quickly to her cabin, her mind already shifting into patterns of thought she had not used in 3 years. She was no longer Rachel Morales, the homesteader. She was becoming something else, something she had hoped never to be again. Inside the cabin, she moved a heavy chest away from the wall and pried up a loose floorboard. The cache beneath contained items she had not touched since arriving in Montana territory. A federal marshal badge, tarnished but still official. A leather gun belt with holsters for 2 Colt Peacemakers, the grips worn smooth from years of use. A Winchester rifle with custom modifications that made it accurate at ranges most men would consider impossible. At the bottom of the cache lay a photograph of a man in cavalry uniform, his arm around a younger version of herself. Captain James Morales had been the only person who knew the truth about her past. The only one who understood that the quiet woman he married had once been the most feared tracker in federal service. He had died 2 years ago, thrown from his horse during a routine patrol, and with him had died the last connection to her old life. Until now. Rachel strapped on the gun belt, feeling the familiar weight settle around her hips. The Colts were perfectly balanced, custom made by a gunsmith in Denver who understood that a weapon was only as good as the person wielding it. She had not drawn them in anger for 3 years, but her hands remembered the motion, the smooth arc from leather to target that had saved her life more times than she could count. The Winchester came next. She had modified the rifle herself, adjusting the trigger, pull, and adding a telescopic sight that allowed for precision shooting at extended range. During her years as a marshal, this weapon had spoken the final word in more arguments than she cared to remember. She was checking the rifle's action when she heard Black Tusk whinny from the corral. The mare was nervous, ears pricked toward the northern ridge where the outlaws had been watching earlier. Rachel moved to the window and studied the tree line through her scope. After a moment, she spotted movement among the pines. They were back, probably thinking they were being clever by watching from a different position. Rachel smiled grimly. These men had no idea what they were dealing with. During her 20 years in federal service, she had tracked Apaches through the desert, hunted train robbers across 3 territories, and brought down gangs that had terrorized entire regions. She had earned her reputation one bullet at a time, and that reputation had followed her even into retirement. The ghost of Gettysburg Ridge. The name still made hardened outlaws look over their shoulders and honest lawmen nod with respect. She had acquired it during her first major case, tracking a gang of Army deserters who had been raiding settlements along the Colorado River. The gang had holed up in a canyon they thought was impregnable, but Rachel had found a way in through a narrow chimney that local Navajo guides had shown her. She had appeared in their camp like smoke, there one moment and gone the next, picking them off one by one until the survivors surrendered in terror. The newspapers had called it the Gettysburg Ridge Massacre, though Rachel knew it had been justice, pure and simple. Those men had been killing families and burning homes, and they had earned every bullet she put in them. But that was the past. This was now, and she had a more immediate problem. 5 men with guns and bad intentions, and a horse they intended to steal. The smart thing would be to saddle Black Tusk and ride for the nearest town, let the territorial marshal handle the situation. But the nearest law was 3 days away, and Rachel had never been one to run from a fight she could win. Besides, these men had made a fundamental error in judgment. They had assumed that a woman alone would be helpless, that they could intimidate her into compliance through threats and superior numbers. They were about to learn that assumptions could be fatal. Night fell with the suddenness of high country autumn, and Rachel made her preparations with methodical care. She moved Black Tusk into the cabin, something the well-trained mare accepted without complaint. The horse would be safer inside, and her absence from the corral might convince the outlaws that their intimidation had worked. Rachel positioned herself in the loft of her barn, where she had a clear view of the approaches to her homestead. The Winchester lay across her knees, loaded and ready, while the Colts rested in their holsters. She had changed into dark clothing that would blend with shadows, and her graying hair was tied back to keep it from interfering with her aim. The waiting was the hardest part. It always had been. During her martial years, she had spent countless hours in similar positions, watching and listening for the first sign of movement. The key was to remain alert without becoming tense, ready to act without anticipating too eagerly. They came at midnight, just as she had expected, 5 shadows moving carefully through the darkness, believing themselves invisible. But Rachel had been watching for movement against stars, listening for the soft sounds that even careful men made when they thought they were unobserved. Larry Murphy led his men in a wide circle around the cabin, probably checking for signs that their target had fled. Finding none, he posted 2 men as lookouts, while the remaining 3 approached the corral. Their disappointment at finding it empty was visible even in the darkness. Murphy gestured toward the cabin, and Rachel could imagine his whispered instructions. Search the house, find the woman, make her tell them where she had hidden the horse. They were probably planning to take her with them, insurance against pursuit, and someone to break in the mare they intended to steal. Rachel watched them approach her front door and felt the familiar coldness settle over her. This was the moment when peaceful Rachel Morales stepped aside and let the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge take control. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, and her world narrowed to the precision of sight picture and trigger control. The first shot took Douglas Williams as he reached for the door latch. The bullet struck him center mass, dropping him instantly and sending his companions scrambling for cover. Rachel worked the Winchester's lever action smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. Alan Torres made the mistake of trying to return fire without identifying her position. His muzzle flash gave her a perfect target, and her second shot ended his participation in the proceedings. 2 down, 3 to go, and the survivors were beginning to understand that they had badly misjudged their intended victim. Thomas Kim shouted from behind the water trough, his voice tight with fear and anger. "You killed Douglas and Alan, you crazy woman. When our friends get here, you are going to pay for this." Rachel shifted her position slightly, keeping the remaining outlaws in sight while making herself a harder target. Your friends are not coming, Thomas. I backtracked your trail yesterday and found your camp. They are probably wondering why you never came back. It was a bluff, but a calculated one. Men like these rarely trusted each other completely, and the suggestion that their partners had abandoned them would plant seeds of doubt and desperation. Paul Ruiz broke cover first, making a dash for the horses they had left tied near the creek. Rachel led him by 2 feet and squeezed the trigger, watching him tumble into the dirt. The Winchester's report echoed off the canyon walls, and in the sudden silence that followed, she could hear the remaining 2 outlaws breathing hard. Murphy's voice came from behind the woodpile, steadier than his companions but carrying an edge of desperation. You are making this harder than it needs to be, lady. We just wanted the horse. Nobody had to die. Rachel chambered another round, the metallic sound carrying clearly in the night air. You made it about more than the horse when you threatened me, Larry. You made it personal when you decided a woman alone would be easy prey. The standoff continued through the long hours before dawn, with Murphy and his last companion pinned down behind inadequate cover, while Rachel maintained her overwatch from the barn loft. She had all the advantages now: superior position, better weapons, and the patience that came from years of similar situations. As the sky began to lighten in the east, desperation finally drove the survivors to action. Murphy and his remaining partner, a thin man Rachel had identified as Jennifer Stewart from wanted posters she remembered, made their break simultaneously. They came from different directions, hoping to divide her attention and create confusion. But Rachel had been expecting this move. She tracked Murphy with her rifle while drawing one of the Colts with her left hand, a maneuver that would have been impossible for most shooters, but was second nature to someone with her training. The revolver barked twice in rapid succession, and Jennifer Stewart's desperate charge ended in a sprawl of limbs and spilled blood. Murphy made it almost to the cabin before Rachel's Winchester spoke again. The bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. He hit the ground hard and stayed down, clutching his wounded arm and staring up at the barn loft where death had been dealing cards all night. Rachel climbed down from the loft with careful deliberation. The Winchester held ready but not quite aimed. Murphy was finished as a threat, but old habits demanded caution until she was certain. She had seen too many supposedly defeated men produce hidden weapons or find strength for one last attack. Murphy looked up at her as she approached, his face pale with shock and pain. "You are her," he said quietly. "You are the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge. We heard stories, but we thought they were just tales to scare greenhorns." Rachel kept the rifle trained on him while she kicked his fallen weapon out of reach. "The stories were true, Larry, every one of them, and you just became part of a new story about what happens to men who threaten what is mine." She bound his shoulder wound with strips torn from his shirt, working with the efficiency of someone who had performed battlefield medicine many times before. Murphy would live, which was more mercy than he had planned to show her. When the territorial marshal arrived, he would find 4 dead outlaws and 1 survivor to stand trial. But first, Rachel had questions that needed answering. She dragged Murphy to a sitting position against the cabin wall, then settled into a chair on her porch with the Winchester across her knees. The morning sun was painting the peaks golden, and birds were beginning their dawn chorus as if nothing had happened. "Who sent you, Larry?" she asked conversationally. 5 men do not ride this far into the mountains just to steal 1 horse, no matter how fine she might be. Murphy tried to maintain his defiance, but the pain and shock were wearing him down. "We heard about the mare from a trader in Missoula, said she was the finest horse he had ever seen, worth a fortune to the right buyer." Rachel studied his face, reading the tells that marked deception. In her martial days, she had interrogated hundreds of suspects, learning to separate truth from fabrication through careful observation. Murphy was holding something back, something important. "Try again, Larry, and this time tell me about the man who offered to buy Black Tusk sight unseen, the one who told you exactly where to find me and how to approach my homestead." Murphy's eyes widened slightly, confirming her suspicion. Someone had been watching her, gathering information about her routines and defenses. Someone who knew enough about her past to understand that direct confrontation would be futile, but who had underestimated her willingness to fight for what mattered to her. Murphy finally broke under her steady gaze, his resistance crumbling like a dam under flood pressure. There was a man in Helena, he admitted, called himself Douglas Williams, said he represented a collector back east who wanted that mare for breeding stock. Offered us $500 to bring her in, no questions asked. Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Douglas Williams was a name from her past, a ghost she had thought buried along with her martial days. If he was involved in this, then the theft attempt was about more than just a valuable horse. It was about drawing her out, forcing her to reveal herself. Williams had been a confidence man and information broker during her active years, someone who sold secrets to the highest bidder and stayed just barely on the legal side of federal law. He had a talent for discovering things that people preferred to keep hidden, and he had tried more than once to leverage her identity for his own profit. She had warned him off years ago, making it clear that any attempt to expose or exploit her would end badly for him. Apparently, time had dimmed his memory of that conversation. "What else did Williams tell you about me, Larry?" she asked quietly. "What did he say about the woman living alone in this valley?" Murphy shifted uncomfortably, his wounded shoulder making movement painful. "He said you were nobody special, just a widow trying to scratch out a living on a hardscrabble homestead. Said you would probably be grateful for the company, might even invite us to stay for supper." The bitter irony was not lost on Rachel. Williams had sent these men to their deaths by feeding them lies about her capabilities. He had known exactly who she was and what she was capable of, but he had told his hired guns nothing that might have saved their lives. She was considering her next move when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the south. A single rider moving at an easy pace and making no attempt at concealment. Rachel positioned herself where she could watch the approaching horseman while keeping Murphy covered. The rider was a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She wore a long coat that could not quite conceal the gun belt beneath it, and her eyes swept the scene of carnage with professional assessment. "Marshal Elizabeth Morris," she announced, dismounting 20 feet from the porch. "I got word there was trouble out this way." Rachel studied the newcomer carefully. Morris was known to her by reputation, a competent lawwoman who had taken over the territorial marshal position 2 years earlier. But her arrival was suspiciously convenient, coming so soon after a gunfight in one of the most isolated valleys in Montana Territory. "Word travels fast out here," Rachel observed, "especially to places where gunshots should not be heard for days." Morris smiled grimly. "Word travels faster when someone is expecting trouble and asks to be notified if it develops. I have been watching for signs that certain people were becoming active in my territory." The implication was clear. Morris knew who Rachel was, and she had been monitoring the situation. The question was whether her intervention was friendly or something else entirely. Morris gestured toward the bodies scattered around the homestead. "Looks like you handled this situation without assistance. Though I have to ask, what happened to the legendary restraint of the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge?" Rachel kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. If Morris knew her identity, then others might as well. The careful anonymity she had built over 3 years was crumbling, and she needed to understand how far the damage extended. "They threatened what was mine," she said simply. "I gave them a chance to walk away. They chose not to take it." Morris nodded as if this explanation satisfied her, then turned her attention to Murphy. The wounded outlaw had been following their conversation with growing alarm, probably realizing that his situation was more complicated than a simple case of horse theft gone wrong. "Larry Murphy," Morris said conversationally, "wanted in 3 territories for robbery and assault. I have been looking for you for quite some time." She produced a pair of iron shackles from her saddlebags and secured Murphy's hands behind his back, ignoring his groans of pain from his wounded shoulder. The outlaw would live to stand trial, but his days of terrorizing isolated homesteaders were finished. Morris straightened and fixed Rachel with a direct stare. "We need to talk, Marshal Morales. There are things happening that affect your situation here." The use of her old title was deliberate, a reminder that some identities could never be completely buried. Rachel had resigned her federal commission 3 years ago, but apparently the badge still carried weight with territorial law enforcement. "I am not a marshal anymore, Elizabeth. I am just a homesteader trying to live quietly in a valley that most people cannot find on a map." Morris smiled without humor. "Quietly. Right. 4 dead men in a gunfight that could be heard in the next county. That is not what most people call quiet." She had a point. But Rachel was not ready to concede anything yet. The situation was developing too quickly, with too many coincidences for comfort. Williams knowing her location, Murphy and his gang arriving with detailed intelligence, Morris appearing within hours of the shooting. Someone was orchestrating events, and she needed to understand who and why. "Tell me about Douglas Williams," she said abruptly. "When did he surface in Helena, and what has he been doing there?" Morris raised an eyebrow at the change of subject, but answered readily enough. "Williams showed up about 2 months ago, claiming to represent Eastern investors interested in territorial development. He has been asking questions about land ownership, mineral rights, that sort of thing." Rachel felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to connect. Williams was not just an information broker anymore. He was working for someone with serious money and specific interest in Montana territory. Someone who wanted her out of the way badly enough to orchestrate an elaborate scheme involving horse thieves and manufactured threats. "What kind of questions was he asking about land ownership?" she pressed. "Was he interested in any particular areas?" Morris hesitated, and Rachel caught the tell immediately. The territorial marshal knew more than she was saying, and her reluctance suggested that the information was sensitive. "Elizabeth," Rachel said quietly, "if you know something that affects my situation, I need to hear it. These men came here to steal my horse, but I think we both know this is about more than livestock." Morris sighed and settled into one of the porch chairs, her hand resting casually on her gun butt. "Williams was asking specifically about your valley, Rachel, about water rights, mineral surveys, railroad easements. Someone wants this land, and they want it badly enough to try removing you through intimidation." The revelation hit Rachel like a physical blow. Her homestead sat on one of the few year-round water sources in the region, and recent surveys had suggested the possibility of valuable mineral deposits in the surrounding mountains. If someone was planning large-scale development, her 40 acres could be the key to controlling much larger holdings. But that still did not explain why Williams was involved, or why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to force her out. A simple cash offer would have been more efficient and less risky than hiring outlaws to terrorize her into leaving. Unless they knew who she was. Unless they understood that the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge would not be easily intimidated, and that any attempt to force her out would require eliminating her entirely. Rachel stood up abruptly, her mind working through implications and possibilities. If someone wanted her land badly enough to orchestrate this kind of scheme, they would not stop with one failed attempt. Murphy and his gang had been the opening move in a larger game, and their failure would only force the real players to escalate their efforts. "Elizabeth," she said urgently, "how many men does Williams have working for him in Helena? And more importantly, who is he really working for?" Morris looked uncomfortable, shifting in her chair like someone who had information she was reluctant to share. "That is where things get complicated, Rachel. Williams is not the man in charge. He is working for someone with connections back east. Someone with enough money to buy influence and enough power to make territorial officials nervous." Rachel felt the familiar, cold certainty settling over her. The same feeling she had experienced before every major confrontation of her martial career. Someone powerful was moving against her, using her past identity as leverage and her current isolation as a weakness. They had underestimated her once, but they would not make that mistake again. "Give me a name, Elizabeth. Who am I really fighting here?" Morris met her gaze steadily. "Thomas Kim, railroad money, political connections, and a reputation for getting what he wants regardless of the cost. He has been buying up land all through this region, sometimes through legitimate offers, and sometimes through methods that are harder to prove in court." The name meant nothing to Rachel, but the description was familiar. She had dealt with men like Kim before, powerful figures who used money and influence to bend laws and intimidate officials. They were dangerous because they operated within the system, using legal mechanisms to achieve illegal ends. But they also had weaknesses. Men like Kim were accustomed to winning through superior resources and political pressure. They rarely faced direct confrontation from someone with her particular set of skills. "What does Kim want with my land specifically?" she asked. "There are hundreds of homesteads in this territory, most of them larger and more valuable than mine." Morris pulled a folded document from her coat pocket and handed it to Rachel. "Survey report, commissioned by Kim 6 months ago. Your valley sits on what could be the richest silver deposit in Montana territory. But more importantly, it controls the only practical route for a railroad spur into the mining district. Rachel studied the survey, reading between the lines of technical language and geological speculation. If the report was accurate, her homestead was worth millions of dollars in mineral rights and transportation access. No wonder Kim was willing to use extreme measures to acquire it. But the timing troubled her. Kim had commissioned this survey 6 months ago, long before she had any reason to expect trouble. That suggested a level of planning and preparation that went far beyond simple land acquisition. Elizabeth, how long has Kim known who I am? How long has he been planning this? Morris looked away, and Rachel knew the answer before she spoke. Kim has had investigators looking into every landowner in the region for over a year. When they identified you as the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge, he decided you were too dangerous to approach directly. The betrayal was complete now. Her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered by money and investigation, and her past had been weaponized against her present. Kim had used her own reputation as a tool to isolate and eliminate her, turning her greatest strength into her greatest vulnerability. But he had made one critical error. He had assumed that knowing her identity would give him an advantage, that understanding her capabilities would allow him to counter them. What he had failed to grasp was that the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge had never been defeated in direct confrontation, and 3 years of peaceful homesteading had not dulled her edge. Rachel walked to the edge of her porch and stared out at the valley that had been her refuge for 3 years. The morning sun was climbing toward its zenith, burning off the mist that clung to the creek and warming the grass where her stolen horse should have been grazing. Everything looked peaceful and normal, but she knew that illusion was about to be shattered permanently. Kim would not stop with one failed attempt. Men like him did not accept defeat gracefully, and they had too much invested in their schemes to walk away from setbacks. He would escalate, bringing more men and better weapons, until he either got what he wanted or eliminated the obstacle standing in his way. Elizabeth, she said without turning around, how long do I have before Kim makes his next move? Morris stood up and moved to join her at the porch railing. Not long. William sent a telegram yesterday morning, probably reporting that his hired guns were in position. When Kim does not hear back by tonight, he will assume the worst and activate his backup plan. Rachel nodded grimly. She had expected as much. Men like Kim always had backup plans, and they usually involved overwhelming force applied without regard for collateral damage. What kind of backup plan are we talking about, she asked. More outlaws? Or something worse? Morris hesitated again, and Rachel could see her weighing the risks of full disclosure against the dangers of keeping secrets. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. Kim has connections with some former cavalry officers who went into private security after the Indian Wars ended. Hard men with military training and no particular regard for territorial law. If he brings them in, you will be facing a small army instead of a gang of horse thieves. The prospect did not frighten Rachel as much as it might have 3 years ago. During her martial career, she had faced similar odds and emerged victorious through superior tactics and intimate knowledge of the terrain. But those victories had come at a cost, leaving her with scars both visible and hidden. How many men? She asked quietly. Morris consulted a small notebook from her pocket. Intelligence suggests Kim can field up to 20 men, all with military experience and modern weapons. They will not make the same mistakes Murphy and his gang made. 20-to-1 odds, with her isolated in a valley that could easily become a trap if properly surrounded. Under normal circumstances, the smart move would be to retreat, to abandon her homestead, and disappear into the wilderness until Kim lost interest or found easier prey. But these were not normal circumstances. This land represented more than just 40 acres and a water source. It was the place where she had tried to build a new life after years of violence and loss. It was where she had buried her husband and made peace with her past. It was home, and she would not be driven from it by threats or superior numbers. Elizabeth, she said finally, I need you to do something for me. Ride back to Helena and send some telegrams. There are people who owe me favors, people who might be willing to even the odds a little. Morris looked skeptical. Rachel, those days are over. Most of your old contacts are either dead, retired, or scattered across the territories. You cannot expect them to ride to your rescue like some kind of cavalry charge. Rachel smiled grimly, remembering faces and names from her martial years. Men and women who had fought beside her, who had trusted her judgment in desperate situations and emerged alive because of her leadership. Some of them had indeed moved on to other lives, but others remained in law enforcement or related fields. More importantly, they remembered the code that had bound them together during the dangerous years. When one of their own called for help, you answered. No questions, no hesitation, no regard for personal cost. Send the telegrams, Elizabeth. Use the old recognition codes, the ones we used during the Apache campaigns. Tell them the ghost needs backup and give them my location. Morris stared at her for a long moment, probably calculating the implications of what she was asking. Bringing in Rachel's old associates would escalate the situation beyond anything Kim might be expecting, but it would also attract attention from federal authorities and territorial officials. Morris finally nodded, understanding that Rachel had made her decision and would not be swayed by arguments about consequences or complications. This is going to get messy, Rachel. When word gets out that you are active again, every outlaw and bounty hunter in 3 territories will take notice. Rachel had already considered that possibility. Her retirement had been accepted largely because she had disappeared so completely, fading into anonymity and allowing her legend to become just another frontier tale. But once she emerged from hiding, once she took up her weapons in anger, there would be no going back to the quiet life. Let them come, she said quietly. I have been the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge for 20 years. I can be her for 20 more if necessary. Morris gathered her reins and prepared to mount her horse, but she paused to deliver one final warning. Kim has political protection, Rachel. If this turns into a shooting war, there will be consequences beyond just the immediate battle. You could find yourself facing federal charges. Rachel met her gaze steadily. Then I guess I better make sure I win decisively enough that political protection becomes irrelevant. Morris rode away toward Helena, carrying with her the messages that would summon ghosts from Rachel's past. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Rachel began her own preparations for the storm that was coming. She started by moving her most valuable possessions into the hidden cache beneath her cabin floor. The photograph of her husband, the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, the deed to her land. If the worst happened, if Kim's men overran her defenses, she wanted these items to survive as testament to the life she had tried to build. Next came the tactical preparations. Rachel walked the perimeter of her homestead with the eye of a professional, identifying fields of fire and potential defensive positions. The valley that had seemed so peaceful and isolated now revealed itself as a natural fortress, with high ground on 3 sides and limited approaches for attacking forces. She spent the afternoon preparing defensive positions, using tools and techniques learned during her martial years. Trenches dug behind natural cover, ammunition caches positioned at strategic intervals, escape routes planned and marked for use in darkness. By sunset, her homestead had been transformed from a peaceful ranch into a military installation. As night fell, Rachel climbed to the highest point on her property and studied the surrounding terrain through her rifle scope. Kim's men would come from the south, following the main trail into the valley. They would expect to find a frightened widow, perhaps defended by a few local ranchers or a territorial deputy. Instead, they would find the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge in her element, fighting for ground she knew better than they did and defending something worth more to her than life itself. The odds might be 20 to 1, but Rachel had faced worse and emerged victorious. She settled into her overwatch position and began the long wait for dawn, when Kim's private army would learn why legends were sometimes based on truth. The attack came with the first light of dawn, just as Rachel had expected. 20 men in military formation, advancing up the valley in textbook fashion with scouts flanking the main force and covering fire provided by riflemen on the ridges. These were not outlaws or hired thugs. These were professional soldiers, and they moved with the confidence of men who had never been defeated. Rachel watched them approach through her rifle scope, cataloging details and identifying their leader. A tall man with graying hair and the bearing of a career cavalry officer, probably one of Kim's former military contacts. He was directing the advance with hand signals, positioning his men to surround her homestead and eliminate any possibility of escape. But he was making the same mistake that had doomed Murphy and his gang. He was assuming that superior numbers and professional training would be enough to overcome a single defender, no matter how skilled. He had not considered the possibility that the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge might have allies of her own. The first sign that his assumptions were wrong came when his lead scout disappeared into a ravine on the eastern approach. One moment the man was visible, the next he was gone, vanishing as if the earth had swallowed him. The officer signaled for his men to halt while he tried to re-establish contact with the missing scout. A rifle cracked from the northern ridge, and one of the flanking riflemen tumbled from his position. The shot had come from an impossible angle, suggesting that Kim's men were not the only ones who had spent the night moving into position. Rachel smiled grimly as she recognized the shooting style. Lisa Thompson had always favored long-range precision shots, and her skills had not diminished during her years as a territorial ranger. The old network was responding, just as Rachel had hoped. The cavalry officer was shouting orders now, trying to maintain control as his carefully planned assault dissolved into confusion. His men were taking cover and returning fire, but they were shooting at shadows and echoes. Rachel's allies knew this terrain intimately, and they were using that knowledge to devastating effect. Rachel added her own voice to the conversation, sending a bullet through the officer's hat to get his attention. When he looked up toward her position, she called down to him in a voice that carried clearly across the valley. "You are trespassing on my land, and you are threatening my home. I suggest you withdraw before this gets any worse for you." The officer's response was predictable. He ordered his men to concentrate their fire on her position, turning the barn into kindling with sustained rifle volleys. But Rachel was no longer there, having moved to a secondary position the moment she revealed herself. The battle raged through the morning, with Kim's professional soldiers gradually realizing that they were outmatched by opponents who knew every rock and tree in the valley. Rachel's allies picked them off one by one, using tactics learned during years of frontier warfare and Indian fighting. By noon, the surviving attackers were in full retreat, carrying their wounded and leaving their dead behind. The cavalry officer had taken a bullet through the shoulder, and his military precision had given way to desperate flight. Kim's private army had been broken by a handful of aging lawmen and one very determined homesteader. Rachel stood on her porch as the last of the attackers disappeared down the valley, the Winchester still smoking in her hands. Her home was scarred but intact, her land was still hers, and the legend of the ghost of Gettysburg Ridge had been renewed in blood and gunpowder. In the distance, she could see her allies emerging from their concealed positions. Lisa Thompson from the North Ridge, Emma Wilson from the Eastern Ravine, and several others whose faces she had not seen in years. They had answered her call without question, just as she had known they would. The quiet life was over, but Rachel found she did not mourn its passing. She was who she had always been, and no amount of peaceful homesteading could change that fundamental truth. The ghost of Gettysburg Ridge was back, and the frontier would remember why that name had once struck fear into the hearts of outlaws and corrupt officials. Thomas Kim would learn that some people could not be bought, intimidated, or eliminated. Some people fought back, and when they did, the consequences could be devastating for those who had underestimated them. Rachel Morales had tried to retire from the war between law and lawlessness, but the war had found her anyway. Now it was her turn to take the fight to her enemies, and she intended to finish what Kim had started.